we're now in 2013. We don't have to feel beholden to these mistakes that were made in earlier years. There's a lot of medical practices that we've abandoned. We've come to understand that they're not right for us anymore. The boy is the patient, not the parent. Circumcision is not in his best interests. First, do no harm. Thank you.
To
Can I just say something because he had a chance to speak last? So there's a couple things. So first of all, you mentioned the different countries. In Australia, actually they had a task force like ours. They actually came out with even a more pro-circumcision approach than we did. And unfortunately, when it went to their board, the person who was anti-circumcision person, so he actually turned it down. They've been working on it. They're going to come back with the document when they have a new president that's going to be actually similar to AAP. Canada has just recently set up their own task force, and theirs will be very similar to AAP. So this rising tide, I think, is not rising necessarily, as you would say. I think people are starting to look at the evidence and seeing that there are health benefits. The other one is Brady, the last patient. He died circumcised, but didn't die from circumcision. His grandfather, who put on his Facebook page, suggesting that his grandson was dying and was bleeding from multiple locations, including the circumcision, that was immediately attacked as if the circumcision causing the bleeding. He had sepsis. And his grandfather asked the anti-circumcision people to please not use him as one of their martyrs, and they refused, despite his frequent attempts. Many of the children who have had complications post-circumcision had illnesses and were circumcised. There was a temporal relationship, not a causal relationship. No question there's children with hemophilia that are having bleeding problems, but we now have how to manage that. And the things that we were seeing in the 50s before we had factor are not a problem anymore. So I really do think that you underestimated the health benefits. You used the 37 experts who, when you read what they said, it was just their opinion. They said the evidence was weak in the African studies. It wasn't weak, it was strong. They made lots of claims without any evidence. And I really do think that that's one of the problems, is much of what you've gone over is not supported by evidence.
Well, okay, so first of all, Brady Tyler Frazier, I have no control over other people who are opposed to circumcision who take action. And there was a very regrettable situation where the family asked for people to lay off and they didn't. I have no control over that. The best evidence we have is if you did die from circumcision, there's plenty of cases where a circumcision happens and a baby dies, and there's reasons made up why he died because of circumcision. We don't know for sure. As far as Australia and Canada, excuse me, can I finish what I'm saying? I'll let you talk, but I please finish. As far as Australia and Canada go, you may have some inside information. What I'm saying right now is there is no national medical association in the world that supports circumcision. None. And I don't think there's going to be any. Perhaps I'll be surprised. I doubt it. There is a rising tide. There's been numerous events in Europe. I'd like to see this evidence about Denmark. I've never heard of that. I Googled it right before I went up there. I didn't see a thing about it. I saw some information from the other side about how politicians had taken action to ban circumcision in Denmark. That's what I saw. We can talk about that later. But, you know, beyond this discussion of evidence, which it boggles the mind that you want to cut babies without their agreement. And the AAP itself says that the risks aren't even known. And yet the AAP wants to go ahead and do this. But they don't want to recommend it because if they recommend it, perhaps they're afraid of being sued. I'm not sure what the reason is for not recommending it. Why, if it's so great, why don't you guys recommend it?
Okay.
All right, I'm going to stand right here. I think we'll take some questions from the audience. This is, I see in the back. Yes.
Speaking of evidence, I noticed on the slide about the selling of foreskins without consent for beauty products. That's the only slide where you didn't have a reference on it. So could you actually elaborate and give some evidence to that claim?
There's plenty of references on that. It's a little sketchy because the cosmetic companies don't want to advertise the source of their tissue necessarily, but there's been plenty of articles written about that. It's quite an interesting topic, actually, and it obviously shouldn't be done. I don't even know if they're ever asking the parents for the agreement for the tissue. As far as we can tell, they aren't. They're just sort of taking the tissue and using it, and in some cases, making quite a lot of money from it.
But fortunately, that has no relevance, because I don't think we would be in support of that.
It's a question.
Mr. Svoboda?
Yes.
Could the low incidence of penile cancer be due to the fact that 7% of U.S. men are circumcised?
Why are the rates lower in Denmark and the other European countries and Japan? Penile cancer is one of the rarest of all cancers, and I thought we had put the issue to rest. I thought people had stopped talking about penile cancer. I was shocked to see it in the 2012 AAP report, honestly, because it seems like such a dead letter. I mean, these 38 eminent doctors in Europe that Dr. Brady doesn't seem to think very highly of seem to agree with that. There's no reason to think about penile cancer. It's a very rare condition. Wash yourself and don't smoke, and you won't get penile cancer.
Well, but again, just last week, the UK is now experiencing a significant increase in penile cancer in men who, in an era where circumcision was decreasing, are now getting more penile cancer. I mean, the epidemiologic data is supportive. Whether it's common or not common will probably depend on which country you're from.
Well, you know, any body part you can take off, and you're going to have fewer conditions with that body part. Should we be taking off breasts to stop breast cancer?
I didn't say take off the penis. I said take off the foreskin.
Well, there's other tissue you can remove and stop other conditions that way.
Dr. Diekema.
Well, I wanted to make a couple comments. I also served on the AAP task force, and wanted to speak specifically to what's becoming an increasingly annoying complaint about that one sentence we put in there that's taken out of context about the risks not being known. As one of the people who helped author that section, I will tell you that actually that was probably poorly phrased, but it's also accompanied by an extensive discussion of the literature surrounding risks, including the incidence. What that one phrase refers to, the incidence of complications being sort of difficult to define, is the fact that it depends on where you look at the data. If you collect your data from somebody who's doing it unsterilely and with a rock instead of a knife, and in a culture that's not the United States, the risks and complications are much higher. We cited some studies that involve tens of thousands of boys, and those incidence rates are the ones we ended up citing primarily in our task force report, and are probably the most reliable ones to sort of draw conclusions from. And so to simply say that we said we didn't know what the complications rate is just inaccurate. I mean, we actually have an extensive discussion on that. It's also, as far as the 100 deaths a year goes, that study is a joke epidemiologically. I've reviewed that study. And what they basically did was they looked at boys and they looked at girls who were infants, and they noticed that boys have a higher mortality rate, and they attributed that entire mortality, increased mortality, to circumcision. Well, it has nothing to do with circumcision. There are other factors related to boys and infant mortality that come into play there, and it's not that they're dying of circumcision. So the one study that says there are 100 deaths a year in the United States is one that had no data whatsoever related to circumcision deaths. It simply made this incredible leap from the fact that little boys have a higher infant mortality rate than little girls do. And
well, part of the problem is the data isn't there to make the study from. And I agree with you, it wasn't a fantastic, airtight study. I did first agree on that. It's clear there's been deaths from the procedure. I mean, that's uncontested. There's a study from Brazil that came out not so long ago that shows a per capita death rate about 1.5 times as high as the number that was quoted for the U.S. Now, Brazil's not the U.S., but the fact that they're showing a higher death rate than the U.S. suggests maybe 100 isn't a crazy number.
100 is a crazy number, and the fact that it's higher in Brazil than the U.S. suggests that we are probably significantly better and probably could still do better. But I can guarantee you that most of the deaths in the past were in hemophilia patients before we had factors. and occasionally from infections, but those are extremely rare. And again, with one study done actually prior to the availability of factor, they had 135,000 children, 100,000 were circumcised, and there were no deaths in the group that was circumcised, and there were deaths in the group that was not circumcised. I'm not suggesting that they're related, but you have to be very careful when you do things like that.
That Wiswell Army Hospital study, I mean, you have to study hospital, just looked at face sheets, and there's been studies showing that 15 to 30% of face sheets aren't even present. They aren't even available. So who knows what the numbers are in that case? I mean, that case has been such an old study, and it's been discredited. I mean,
no, it's not been discredited. It's not been discredited. There's no question there was face sheets, but there was an expectation that the loss of face sheets was random. And it wasn't like, oh, this child was circumcised, had a problem, we'll lose that one. It was, yes, it was, I mean, before electronic health records and other ways where you could collect all the data, but it was done in a randomized fashion so that it was not biased. That's the key issue, is bias.
Well, it's junk statistics. I mean, my wife's a pediatrician, and she looked at that 0.006% thing on your slide, and she just laughed and said, that's ridiculous. Nobody in the audience is going to believe it. I mean, that's what she said.
Dr. Brady, I'd like to engage you in a respectful dialogue about your claim that circumcision has no adverse effect on sexual function, sensitivity, sensation, or satisfaction. So first thing I would say is that defies common sense.
It doesn't, but fine.
Well, if I might continue. Regarding function, if you don't have a foreskin, then it's unable to fold and unfold over the glands and back to the base of the penis. And in the gliding action, it's often referred to of an intact man. If you don't have a foreskin, it does not have that function. It seems to me indisputable, beyond debate, that circumcision destroys normal sexual function.
Okay, so there's no question that removal of foreskin removes that particular skin. The question is then, are the other portions of the penis capable of providing accommodation to maintain the same level of sensitivity and function? And I mentioned in the study in Africa where they did a randomized controlled trial of people who were adults and who were circumcised. They removed the foreskin. They had experienced sexual activity prior to removal of the foreskin, were circumcised, and then had sexual activity after being circumcised. When they were specifically asked, it did not seem to represent a particular problem. As a matter of fact, there was a reasonable, a higher proportion who said they had better function and sensitivity than said that they had reduced. So there was a sum in each. Most of them said it had no impact. So while you say, well, if you remove some tissue, it should actually have common sense that it results in reduction in some kind of function, it appears that the remaining tissue is able to accommodate.
Well, first thing, it does destroy the normal function. You didn't say otherwise. I mean, it cannot function the way it did before. So that point is beyond dispute. Now on to the question, does it affect sensation, satisfaction, and pleasure?
Right.
And you've conceded that the foreskin is highly innervated, highly vascularized. There are studies showing that it's the most sensitive part of the penis. And it defies common sense, and it's not credible to me. I'll tell you, I don't believe it, that you can remove a third to a half of the penile skin and mucosa and not affect sensation. Moreover, the AAP has acknowledged that circumcision affects men's sex lives. It changes how it changes sex. They masturbate more. They engage in more dangerous sexual activity. This was in the AAP report itself,
which report?
In about 1999.
So first of all,
it changes men's sex lives.
Actually,
men don't want
that came from Lauer in 1997 originally.
Yeah, but I can tell you that there have been a number of studies since then that have suggested that that's not the case. That it doesn't. I mean, there's numerous studies that have looked at sexual health, so the things that we were just discussing, and when you look in the Australian study or whatever, of very large numbers, it didn't have any impact on that.
I think if you remove all that tissue and it's innervated, you are going to change sensation. You're going to change change satisfaction, whether it's better or worse. And men don't want to have their penis the foreskin removed. They don't want their sex lives changed. They want to have the sex lives that whatever that evolved or God gave them. They don't want doctors like you saying that they've taken a survey and there's no impact and it makes no difference. And that's why autonomy is so important in these legal concepts, because people should not have doctors coming along and deciding what's best for a child. The man should decide for himself.
Okay.
It's their parents who are deciding.
Right. It's the parents, not the doctor. And the other situation is that when you're looking at best interests, the parents are going to weigh all these things. The health benefits, the potential complications, and they're going to try to determine over some period of their child's life what's in the best interest.
Well, I'm an attorney. I can tell you there's absolutely no way that parents have the right to decide on behalf of their children whether to remove a body part for religious, cultural, and personal reasons that have nothing to do with medicine. You won't find that principle anywhere in the principle of ethics or in the legal principles. And in Prince versus Massachusetts, the Supreme Court held that parents do not have the right for religious or other reasons to even risk harming their children for any reason. And in fact, the law is the parents have a duty to protect their children from harm, and physicians have the same duty as well.
That's correct. And so if the health benefits exceed the risk, then in the best interest of the child, you are reducing harm and providing benefit.
But you have to include harms as well as complications. You have to look at what's lost. That's the problem.
And I'm saying that there's no evidence that there's a valid loss. In other words, I appreciate that you have a hard time trying to understand why there wouldn't be a loss, but what I'm saying is it turns out that we can't identify a loss.
I think Dr. Block has a comment in the back.
The only person in this room who's going to jail after this talk. Hang on for a second. A couple things arise when you discuss your ethics issue. Number one is, what about all these mothers that pierce the baby's ears at 1 month and 2 weeks age? So they should also be, they're also unethical.
No, because there's no tissue loss in that.
And I've seen more keloid formation.
Oh, we see a lot of companies.
That and circumcision.
I'm not talking about the antibiotics.
That's pointing out.
Dr. Block.
I'm sorry.
We've also done a lot of antibiotics because of infected tissue there. Sometimes IV antibiotics because of infected tissue. So there's one statement. Second statement is, what about supernumerary digits and preauricular skin tags? They're cosmetic. Get rid of them, takes a procedure, could be a little risky, could be blood loss, could be bleeding, etc. Yes, we do have an example of a cosmetic procedure, taking off a piece of the baby's tissue, unwittingly, unknowingly, guided by the parent's consent and the doctor's wishes, the doctor's best evidence.
So
we do have that in this time in the office.
So what percentage of children are having that death event? What's that?
1%.
So is that a normal thing that people just come along and do it without examining that child's specific condition, or do they look at the child's specific condition? I mean, there's lots of examples you can come up with. They're not very good analogies, but you can look at intersex children. There's cutting that happens to them to make them into either a boy or a girl. So people feel more comfortable with that.
It's not normal. You say it forever. Never caused any growth. Factory deficit.
It's abnormality. Well, that's like a cleft lip analogy. I mean, that's a different situation.
No, it's not. No, this is strictly cosmetic. It's an extra digit, extra preauricular tag. Has no bearing except cosmetics. It's identical. Or you should take it off because the parent wants to, because they think it's cosmetically disfiguring. That's the only reason we do it. And there is some risk with those things too. Actually, I've seen bone infection from it. Yet we still do it. We still think it's worthwhile doing. So I'm saying there are examples of this precise argument that you're giving us.
Well, I wouldn't say it's a precise equivalent, but I think it really comes down to what are we going to spend our resources, our scarce health dollar resources, on something that doesn't have any medical reason to be doing it? Or are we going to instead use our scarce medical resources on procedures that will actually promote the health of the child? And not risk the danger that the child may actually come to serious injury or death from this procedure. I mean, you're saying it doesn't happen very often. To the parent of the child that it happened to, that's not very much consolation, is it?
Okay, but for the child who dies of HIV, for the child who dies of cervical cancer.
But that's not created by the procedure, is my point. That's the difference.
Okay, so first of all, you're talking about healthcare resources. I've already shown you that it's cost saving to actually circumcise more males. So that from the standpoint of our health resources, it actually is in the best interest of the public to be able to reduce healthcare costs. And it would be, $500 million minimum just for the HIV protection, and probably another $500 million for the other things in each birth cohort. So it is health savings. And, I do...
Those studies, the way they determine those numbers in Africa, trying to project them into the U.S., there's so many problems with it. It's garbage in, garbage out. I mean,
it wasn't garbage in, garbage out.
Getting information that is meaningless. I mean,
why is it meaningless when you've got like 15 of the best epidemiologists in the CDC parsing down? They knew the exact proportion of people in the United States that have the prevalence, what the transmission rates are, looked at the Africa situation, and were able to work out how that translated into our population.
How they think it will. But the U.S. is very different from Africa. The epidemiology is different. The transmission modes are different. And children are different from adults. And Africa is poverty-stricken. And the AAP 2012 report says all this. So I can't believe you're arguing with me about it.
I think so we may argue about the epidemiology. There's a question.
So I'm a member of one of the cultures that practices circumcision. And it's one of the most joyful and culturally inclusive events in our religion. And I'm just wondering how you balance your feelings about circumcision while trying to maintain a respect for religious freedoms.
Well, it's interesting you mentioned that because we're actually raising our children Jewish, and we don't see incompatibility there at all. I mean, and I'm not Jewish myself, so I think the Jewish decision has to be left to the Jewish people, and I think their decision will be informed by the things that happen in the world. And far be it for me to try to dictate it on that point. But I do think that when a child's born, he goes into the ritual. It's beautiful. It's great. I respect that. I mean, does he cry? Is he upset, or is he happy about having his foreskin removed? I don't know. I mean,
takes about a minute. There's the whole family around. Everybody's happy and joyful, and the baby's going to cry an hour later when the diaper's dirty. So, I don't think that's a valid argument.
Well, so studies are pretty clear that the crying for the circumcision is different from the crying from the dirty diaper. That's pretty
should be with good anesthesia. That was old stuff.
Just a question here.
Yeah, Dr. Brady. I felt that there was a really great point in Mr. Svoboda's presentation that perhaps you could answer. According to your view of medical ethics, what other functional organ or body part do you feel it's ethical to amputate without any kind of diagnosis or problem or consent?
Appendix? Yeah.
Without a diagnosis or consent?
No, appendix sometimes, with consent. You get consent. There are times when people have abdominal surgeries.
Right.
They determine that it's not related to the appendix. They
right. The question is without consent.
Well, I mean, this is consented.
Right. So what, other than the foreskin, what functional tissue would you amputate without any kind of diagnosis or consent?
Okay, I wouldn't do any without consent.
So what is it that makes the foreskin special and that men don't have the right?
You get consent.
From the parent.
From the parent, you get consent.
Okay. So what is it about the foreskin that makes it special than any other body part that you do not have to have the same priority that you would have for...
You could take out the appendix on a child who has abdominal surgery. The parents can consent to having the appendix removed.
How frequent is that now that we understand the function of the organ in question?
What do you mean?
How common is that now that we understand that?
It used to be actually routine without consent.
Right. But now that we have better understanding, then we move along.
Well, I mean, the appendix doesn't provide a lot of benefit, so actually it happens not infrequently.
Because
I can't give you a number.
Because there's some issue.
No, it's the appendix is there, and you're doing a surgery for interception, and you say, well, I'm in there. Maybe I should take out the appendix. You tell the parents, they say, okay, then you take out the appendix.
Okay. I'm just trying to divide the difference between the foreskin and other...
The appendix can result in appendicitis, and if you remove it, you don't have that. So you've got a health benefit. There's a risk, because if you remove it, you may end up with a stitch that comes loose or something like that, and then with peritonitis or something like that.
So why is it that you don't just go ahead and take everybody's appendix out?
Why is it that you don't? That I can't tell. I'm not a surgeon. I know that it happens frequently. I don't know when it doesn't or when it does, but I know it happens frequently. But it does happen with consent, and they ask the parents, and the parents consent.
Doctors.
Yeah, actually, I have several questions, but I'm only going to ask one. And that is, Mr. Svoboda, the title of your talk is Newborn Male Circumcision is Unethical and Should Be Illegal. You've talked about the legalities of it, but I'm wondering whether you're serious about working toward passing a law that would make it a felony or perhaps a lesser criminal penalty for example, Dr. Wasserstein or my children or the children of any number of people in this room, that they would be forbidden to have a circumcision for their child with a penalty of going to jail, being fined, or suffering some other criminal penalty. Do you believe that? Is that your position?
We haven't taken a position on that. I think it's a tricky issue. A number of persuasive people have written about reasons not to do that. There have been some counterproductive aspects. For example, female genital mutilation in African countries, when it's been made illegal, it's been counterproductive in certain ways. So that's more of a political question, really, than a legal question. My point really is that if you look at the laws that exist in this country objectively and the human rights protections, that it is contrary to the laws right now. Now, what happens with laws, it evolves over time. People come to understand. There was this section of the Civil Rights Law that was passed back over 100 years ago in the wake of the Civil War, and it wasn't used for like 100 years. And civil rights lawyers dusted it off in the 1960s and used it to prevent governments from acting under color of law, it's called. So it happens frequently that our understanding of the law evolves and changes, and the legalities change as a result, and society changes as a result. But I'm not a big fan of going in and legislating something that our society isn't ready for. But my goal is to talk about the problems with this practice and why we shouldn't be doing it, and to raise awareness. That's really what we're trying to do.
So let me ask, let someone who hasn't talked to him, yes. Yeah.
I have probably a pretty simple question. I'm a nursing student, so I don't know a whole lot about any of this, but I was just wondering, kind of, I guess, since a newborn is more fragile than, say, like a 4-month-old, if everything develops properly, do people ever wait until 4 months to get circumcision?
There's two situations where that happens. So first of all, the complication rate is far lower in the newborn period, even than compared to 4 months.
Lamucci says exactly the opposite of that.
And he's wrong, because if you look at the data, it's very clear. I showed you up there, there's plenty of studies. It's much more difficult, much more expensive, and complication rates are much higher. So that's one issue. Now, there's a couple things that have happened. One, with the short hospital stays now, there are a lot of kids that get kicked out of the hospital before they've had time to get their circumcision. So yes, people are doing the circumcisions later. And that actually is reflected in the new CDC data on the proportion of children in the United States that are getting circumcised. They only use newborn circumcision in that, and it's gone down. But in reality, what's going up is circumcisions occurring a month to 4 months of age in the children who got discharged from the hospital too early. Stanley's going to have.
Tony does all those. After 2 months, we don't do them because it really is. You can see the difference in pain. It's huge. The baby's too big to press down and do all this stuff. Whereas a newborn, they're pretty complacent with that. You can put the sugar, that's right in their mouth. You can throw some penile, nerve block, and they're good. They don't even cry. It's nothing to them. Whereas a bigger kid, they're in a crowd, they've bloody murdered, you're straining them, they just go nuts. So after 2 months, they're too big, too much, there really is much more pain. There's a huge difference between a 2-day-old and a 2-month-old with pain receptors. It's huge, guys. It's huge.
When the little ones don't cry, it's because they go into shock typically. And it says...
they're not in shock.
They're sitting there, there's something wrong with those breasts.
If it doesn't hurt to cut your
You should watch
penis,
the
why would it?
videos of the practice being
No
done.
nerves there.
You know, there's plenty of physicians that did them every day for a long time, and then one day they realized, oh my God, why am I doing this? Why am I operating on healthy? Why am I operating on healthy boys and taking off functional tissue? And they realize with horror what they've been doing. and they stop.
Okay.
And so, you think the boys are just quite happy about it? Why don't you do it when they're 2 months old if it's so great? Why don't you do it when they're 6 months old if it's so great? Why don't you do it when they're 5 years old if it's so great?
It's just a huge difference. But
Exactly.
A lot of difference because UTIs, having seen several kids with UTIs that are uncircumcised.
UTIs are 3 times more common in girls than boys in the first year of life. Why aren't we circumcising girls?
Same age.
Why are we circumcising?
First year blades are the same.
Let me finish. Smoking mirrors. Smoking mirrors. Okay. So, UTIs, we've had babies wind up in the hospital with IV fluid, IV antibiotics, and septic because of being uncircumcised. It's definitely true. We know that. All the data shows that. And that's not a pleasant experience for the parents, for us, and the baby. So, and that's a 1% rate that we know of for sure that occurs when babies are uncircumcised versus 1 in 1,000 for babies who are circumcised. It's almost unheard of. So there is a huge difference, and the cost to the family, the society, et cetera, is significant for that too. So there are things, and then we got HIV, we got HPV, we got all those things. And you mentioned penile cancer, it's caused by HPV for the most part. Right. So it's not caused by circumcision, uncircumcision so much. It's because you reduce the rates of HPV in those folks because you take off the foreskin, that they don't get penile cancer so much.
And it's even, the UTI rate is the same in the first year of life for males and females, and it's not until after age 1 that it switches to be a female predominance, but it's exactly the same. And in circumcised, uncircumcised, there's a 10-fold difference. I mean, that's clear.
It's huge.
And as he mentioned, so you're talking about, we have kids who die from urinary tract infections. So I mean, there's no question that you can look at this both ways, but you can be harming a child and maybe have them die from urinary tract infection 10 times greater risk if they're not circumcised.
Plus, they have to go through different procedures. They have to have an IVP or
You're convinced me circumcision's great. Let's find some other body parts we can cut off too. I mean, there must be some other functional body parts we can cut off. Great. Let's keep going.
Yeah, I have a question for you again.
Sure.
It's about benefits. I think it's a really important question if I understand it correctly. So Dr. Diekema was saying that the practice of medicine is all about beneficence, benefiting the child.
Right.
And you're saying circumcision has lots of benefits, but aren't they really still potential benefits that most boys and men are not likely to enjoy? In other words, 1 in 100 boys might benefit if your claims are true, meaning that 99 out of 100 don't. And with respect to penile cancer, if it reduces the risk by 1 out of 900 people or 1 out of 300,000 people, I think was in the AAP report, that means up to 250,000 people lose their foreskins for nothing. And with respect to HIV, it's something like 1 in 67 might benefit them for some unknown period of time. So you're not benefiting each child and man.
Right. So correct? You take all those math, and now it comes down to maybe 1 in 50 benefits or 1 in 40. However, with vaccines, it's the same thing. We give children vaccines. They have benefits and risks to prevent, as was mentioned this morning, mouse influenza type B meningitis. Okay, there were 12,000 cases of H. flu meningitis in the United States prior to the vaccine. It wasn't 4 million, which is the birth cohort, but it was 12,000. And there are potential risks associated with giving vaccines. But it was felt that because you cannot predict ahead of time which child is going to benefit by receiving the vaccine, that from a public health perspective and for the individual, you are providing benefit by reducing the risks. Now, can I say for sure if I circumcise a child that I'm protecting that child from getting HIV? No. But if I circumcise a large number, I can protect a large number, a smaller proportion from getting HIV. And from that perspective, I think it provides benefit to everybody.
I don't think that's ethical. I think it violates funds of ethics. I believe you need to benefit each and every patient.
So we should stop doing vaccines?
Yeah.
We should stop vaccines. Because you're saying that unless I can guarantee that giving something that has a potential risk provides benefit to that particular child, I shouldn't do it. We should go back to having polio. We should go back to having smallpox. We should go back to having all these diseases.
Aren't they very effective, though? Immunizations?
Yeah, and so is reduction of the diseases with circumcision.
Doesn't sound like it to me. 1 in 67 people, 1 in 100.
Well, I mean, you're talking about the same thing with vaccines. That's the same level of value. I said there's 12,000 cases of mopsley influenza type B meningitis with 4 million children. I can't quickly do the math, but you can see that it's not, given the vaccine is going to protect that child.
Some of those diseases are probably communicable, right?
Yes.
So I believe the law allows an exception for that.
So is HIV, so is HPV, so is herpes simplex, so is syphilis.
The other diseases, can't you get them just walking around?
Walking around?
Yes, if you're in a school and there are people with measles and the like,
yes,
you can get them.
Yeah.
But you have to affirmatively have sex with an HIV-infected woman to get HIV.
I don't see what the difference is. That's part of being a human. So I mean, going to school or having sexual activity,
I think I know the answer. Is that with immunizations, there's no other way to avoid that disease. That men would choose not to get measles, polio, and the like if they had the choice. But men can use.
We can give people intravenous immunoglobulin once a month. I mean, we could do other things. For mopsley influenza type B, we could put people on rifampin every day for the rest of their life. We could do that. It would be silly, but we could do it. There are other alternatives, but vaccines just happen to make the most sense, and the same thing is true with the use of getting health benefits from circumcision.
Why doesn't any medical association in the world agree with that then?
Well,
why doesn't the AAP?
Okay.
Why doesn't the AAP even recommend
Australia
it?
tried.
So great, the AAP doesn't recommend the procedure.
Okay.
Well, why don't men use condoms then? They're much more effective.
Okay. That's a much bigger question. That I'm in charge of an HIV program. I have HIV-infected male patients. Every time I see them, I bang over their head they need to wear condoms. And they bring in partners that are infected. Okay? So, why do they not wear them? They've got a zillion reasons. They didn't have it with them, whatever. It doesn't happen.
There's one question. I guess I'd like to turn the heat down a little bit and ask a more prosaic question. I was interested in your explanation about the African studies about sexual experience before and after circumcision. One thing that struck me about the study is that the way of measuring this is remarkably crude.
Yes.
You just ask these questions and you get these answers, and who knows what to make of them.
Oh no, they had what I listed up there was kind of the summation.
Oh, I see.
They asked a lot of things.
Okay.
That was the summation.
Fair enough. Because what struck me then was it sounds like evidence on either side of this issue is going to really be pretty hard to come by. And so claims about making sexual proficiency worse are just likely to be equally implausible. But the population, these are adult males in Africa who've had circumcision. Have they had circumcision for some kind of medical reason?
No,
is it just customary, they just do it when they're adults?
This was a research trial, and they were recruited. And
just as healthy volunteers.
Healthy volunteers that were recruited, and they were randomly assigned being circumcised or not circumcised, and told that if the study showed that circumcision was valuable, that they could have a circumcision for free later.
Oh,
and that was the study.
That's very illuminating. Thanks.
It would not happen in the United States.
No.
All right, I think there's time for one final question.
I just had a question about kind of piggybacking off of that question. Were the volunteers that did the adult males that were circumcised, were they compensated in any way? I mean, I can imagine it's probably extremely painful as an adult male.
They weren't. What happened was they were told that they would have circumcision done in a sterile environment by medical personnel, and that there was epidemiologic data suggesting that if they were circumcised, there might be a reduction in acquisition of HIV. So they perceived that as a possible benefit, but they weren't given any money or anything to participate.
Were they giving any pain medication before?
Yeah, it was done with analgesic. Yeah.
Well, I would like to thank both speakers. It's been a lot of